Thank you for coming. My name is William Saunders. I am director of the Human Rights Program with the Institute for Human Ecology. The Institute for Human Ecology is one of the nation's leading institutes committed to identifying the conditions conducive to human flourishing from an interdisciplinary and Catholic perspective, bringing scholars from across the university, the country, and the world here to CUA. I want to thank the staff of the IHE, the Executive Director Russ Hittinger, and the Managing Director Stephen Higgins, and the rest of the team, and particularly Nate, for organizing this event tonight. As I said, I'm the director of the Human Rights Program, and you might think, what does this have to do with human rights? And my answer is it has everything to do with human rights, because our fundamental assumption in the Human Rights Program is that human rights attach to every human being without exception. And in fact, as part of our program, it's as like a master's degree. It's 10 courses. One of them is a required course in bioethics. So our speaker tonight fits perfectly with that. Let me say, before I introduce him, a word about the National Catholic Bioethics Center, where he is the president. In 1972, the Pope John Paul XXIII Medical and Moral Research and Education Center was chartered in St. Louis, Missouri, with the assistance of the Catholic Health Association and His Eminence John Cardinal Carberry. It's been quite a number of years since 1972, and during that period of time, the name of the organization has changed and its location has changed. And in 2004, the National Catholic Bioethics Center moved its offices to Philadelphia in order to be closer to the policy centers of New York and Washington, and close to the rich religious and academic communities of the Mid-Atlantic region. The mission of the NCBC is to provide education, guidance, and resources to the church and society, and to uphold the dignity of the human person in healthcare and biomedical research. On January the 1st, 2025, Dr. John Di Camillo became the 7th president of the NCBC. And I have to give one or two disclaimers. First, I've written a column for the National Catholic Bioethics Center's quarterly for, I think, going on 20 years, back to the stem cell debates and the cloning battles and the battle over healthcare reform that we know as Obamacare. Second thing I have to say is that John has been a student of mine, so we'll see if he learned anything. He joined the NCBC as a staff ethicist in 2011, and he became its personal consultations director in 2022, and as I said, became president in January of this year. He's published in numerous journals, and he's given numerous presentations on healthcare ethics, including NCBC's workshop for bishops, which I had the privilege of addressing when we had the fight and all the litigation over the contraceptive mandate. And also, of course, he's spoken to diocesan clergy convocations and the Catholic Medical Association's annual boot camp for medical students. He's taught in high school, middle school, high school, at the undergraduate level, and the graduate level. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania and earned his bioethics doctorate and his licentiate degrees from the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome. And tonight, as you can see on your screens, he will talk to us about the AI revolution in bioethics, what it means for the human person and for human rights. John. I have to say one thing before he starts. As you came in, you see we'll have a reception afterwards, to which you're all invited, and we'll take Q&A.
Thank you very much, Bill. And it's a little bit strange to call you Bill because you were my professor. But yes, so actually, I do remember from the class that you taught, that was the first time that I learned about Roe versus Wade and about the language of the penumbras and emanations. And I remember you formulating those words. And so that has definitely stuck with me ever since. And I'm very pleased to say, of course, that now that court decision has been overturned since Dobbs, which was actually the date on which we launched the Personal Consultations Department at the National Catholic Bioethics Center back in 2022. Well, thank you also, of course, to Bill for inviting me. Thank you to Dr. Maureen Kondik also for coordinating a visit with me here at the Catholic University of America. Thank you to the provost, Dr. Aaron Dominguez, here with us, and to all of the rest of the faculty and administrators I met with, because I had quite a full day of meetings today with a number of faculty and administrators here at CUA. So thank you to each and every one of you. It's a real honor, and it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here at the Catholic University of America. I will actually add, since you were mentioning some of the history of the NCBC there, the move in 2004 to Philadelphia, well, it just so happened to coincide with exactly the time when I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania studying neuroscience. And so I learned about this National Catholic Bioethics Center and that they had student memberships. And so I actually became a student member of the National Catholic Bioethics Center almost 21 years ago now. And so I've been there ever since, in one form or another, through my bioethics formation and to ultimately this year being named president. So it's a great honor, it's a great privilege to be here and working for and leading now such a great organization. I have one very important disclaimer to start with as well, which is, of course, I am not actually an expert in AI. I am an expert in bioethics. I've been in the field for over 20 years, going back to that time, 14 years as a full-time staff ethicist with the NCBC, and I've seen quite a lot of things in the area of healthcare delivery. We at the NCBC serve the bishops, we serve dioceses, Catholic healthcare institutions, Catholic medical professionals, nurses, clergy, and religious, all on the front lines. And so through the experience that I've had working there, I've seen many, many things in the field of bioethics, but AI is definitely something new. And it's definitely something that involves and that requires all of us to come together, to put our heads together, and to reflect more deeply on this question of artificial intelligence. And so what my aim today is going to be is really to help us think through, or to just reflect on how we navigate this revolution, starting from the humble place that I am no AI expert myself, but we have plenty of those people in the room, and we have this great effort actually recently announced with the appointment of Taylor Black as the director of the new Institute for AI and Emerging Technologies here at Catholic University of America. So I'm excited, I am pleased to hear about these great initiatives to continue the research and reflection on this topic. So that all said, I'd actually like to start with a little prayer of Psalm 143. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Teach me the way I should go, for to thee I lift up my soul. Teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. Let thy good spirit lead me on a level path. Amen. Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And now what we all just did is something AI can never do, right? What we all just did, putting ourselves in the presence of our Lord, or even just for a silent moment of recollection, if you weren't praying, is something AI cannot do, because we have a soul, and only we, with that soul, as personal beings, with a spiritual, rational soul, can have a personal relationship with God. And so, while AI can do some incredibly amazing things, and it can be a useful and helpful tool, something as simple as a prayer is something it will never be able to do. So, for those of you who may wish to fall asleep or to leave early and only have maybe 5 minutes here, the overall themes and the quick summary of this talk is basically we need to approach AI, to navigate the AI revolution with authentic personal encounter, with increased relationship and collaboration as human persons. We need to remember that AI should only ever assist us and never serve to replace our communities and human relationships or to replace genuine human companionship. And we should do all this in the context of seeking and striving for the common good, which is very apt for this Institute of Human Ecology event dedicated to the understanding of how we achieve this human flourishing at a community level. That is the common good. So I'll take us through just quickly bioethics and AI, some reflections on AI, including that core of the human person, and some church teachings as they relate to AI, and then a conclusion about some of what we need to navigate this revolution. So when I told a friend of mine that I was going to be coming to give a talk on artificial intelligence, he said, "Oh, well, you're a bioethicist. What does that have to do with artificial intelligence?" Right? Like, that's its own whole field of technology. It's completely unrelated to anything that has to do with bioethics. And I said, well, actually, there are a lot of connecting points that AI has with bioethics, as we will see. Now, first of all, we have to understand what AI is. And again, I'm well aware there are a number of different ways of defining artificial intelligence. I did my research to prepare for this. I just pulled a simple definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica, where it says the ability of a digital computer or computer-controlled robot to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings. This is a very interesting definition to me, especially because the way that we often hear people talking about AI, it can seem like AI is a being, like it's a thing, right? Oh, AI can do this or AI can do that. It's almost like we're already personalizing it like it's a being. But it's defined very clearly as an ability in this version or rendering of what artificial intelligence is. And I think that's important because it points us to the functional nature of artificial intelligence, that it's ultimately about doing something. It's not about being something. And so, what are some examples of artificial intelligence? I put some abbreviations up here. ML, machine learning, which could be supervised or unsupervised machine learning. ANN, artificial neural networks. Deep learning, DL. Narrow AI. General AI, or artificial general intelligence. There are all sorts of developments in the AI world and different categories and particular distinctions here. And I can't get into all the details of what that means. Again, I don't know all of those particulars, but one thing is clear, that what AI is doing in any of these iterations is essentially processing data, and it is giving outputs. It is taking inputs, and it is giving outputs. And so one of the big things that comes with artificial intelligence is recognizing that one way or another, at the end of the day, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're talking about something that receives inputs and gives outputs. But that's it, right? There's nothing more to it. However, it may appear to be, as we see in the definition, tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings. So, it looks like this is doing something human. It appears that this is an intelligent being because it's doing the kind of things we typically associate with humans doing. Yuval Harari, who's one of the big names in the AI field and transhumanism, has been very, very particular about calling artificial intelligence not artificial intelligence, but alien intelligence. And the reason he says this is because the intelligence Now, of course, I would quibble with the fact it's intelligence at all, and we'll come to that later. But he calls it alien intelligence because he's saying that it can actually make decisions and do things or come up with decision paths that are creative and that are different and that are beyond what a human being could come up with. So they're beyond what human intelligence could do, and there's something that the designers and producers of the algorithms perhaps themselves could not have thought of on their own. And so in this sense, it is other, it is foreign, it is alien to our human intelligence, something other and different from. But what I found most striking about this, when he talks about this alien intelligence, is his reference to the decisions. And of course, that's really critical when we're talking about bioethics and the connecting points with bioethics, because ethics is about decision making. Ethics is about the moral conscience. It's about the good life, those choices that make us virtuous, those things that are upright actions. And when you talk about a decision suggests or is like ethics, right? It suggests that there is some component here that we're judging as good or bad. And he references, for example, situations of warfare. And he talks about weapons. And he says things like, hey, you know, actually the real threat with artificial intelligence is something like not that the human beings will not be decision makers, but that actually AI is going to make the decisions, but then the human beings are going to execute those decisions. Which to me as an ethicist says, wait a minute, that's strange. Because what you're doing is, so like the AI would tell you, here's the target, and the human being would pull the trigger. That's not what I typically think of, but that's what Yuval Harari is concerned about. And if you apply a similar principle to something like healthcare, for example, which is tied to this field of bioethics, you could get a situation where you have algorithms that produce a decision pathway for patients who may have terminal illness. You could think about care pathways. You could think about quality-adjusted life years and some of the formulas that we've already been using in places like England. And how could we come up with or use AI to tell us, hey, patient X should get treatment Y based on this algorithm? And now it becomes a question of, I, the doctor, simply have to do what AI tells me. And so there's a danger of passing the buck, as it were. The moral agent, who's the medical professional, is now told, hey, here's the decision pathway, here's the algorithm that leads us from point A to point B. And this could actually become medical standards of practice. Now, we could have AI that begins to draft medical standards of practice for us. Because if we start to say, hey, actually the major medical associations produced all of this literature and all of these guidelines and policies, and AI is going to scan all of these and come up with new or improved protocols. Maybe it's going to incorporate new data that it's gleaning from the systems in healthcare in order to come up with updated guidelines that no human made. And here's the new standard of care that you have to follow. And hey, AI put it together. This is the new standard. We trust that this is going to be best. And we just implement. And now in a court of law, you're following a standard of care, the reference point that has been produced essentially by artificial intelligence, which is not human and has no moral agency. And so again, we sort of risk essentially eliminating the proper role of human conscience and the process for developing sound policies and practices by sort of handing it over to AI. Now, that's not to say there's no good role for AI. Of course, artificial intelligence could be part of a process of pulling together billions and billions of studies on certain medical interventions and the outcomes, and give us a direction or a path for the best treatment outcomes that then is reviewed by real people who then incorporate their own wisdom and judgments and professional expertise to come up with an actual standard of care, for example. So let's talk a little bit more about what bioethics actually is. Bioethics goes back actually to about 1972 when the NCBC was founded, as far as the field is concerned and the term bioethics is concerned. It deals predominantly with threats to human dignity, especially in the areas of, let's say, the traditional, what we would call, certainly in the Catholic world, intrinsic moral evils, or in terms of natural moral law. Things like contraception, sterilization, abortion, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, transgender surgical mutilations, these things, the list goes on and on. We could talk about even things like cloning. Okay, these are the things that typically come to mind when we're thinking of bioethics. And I mention this because I find it very fascinating how we've gone from what I would call a very clinical ethics approach, or an intrinsic moral evils approach, to bioethics, and saying, hey, here are these sorts of interventions that should not be done, and which were major points of contention in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And it was sort of bioethics, and especially our center at the NCBC, were sort of called to hold the line and to say, hey, in the healthcare world, we actually should not be opening up to allowing abortions or to allowing direct contraception and so on and so forth. And that's a very clinical and sort of individual focused, patient focused. And so a lot of bioethics has been patient focused, care scenarios. This was tied in to the human rights question because it's a question of respecting the human body, right? We can't violate the dignity of the human person, of the human body, through these kinds of various mutilating interventions or other intrinsic immoral actions. And of course, we could add to that list things that later came along, like in vitro fertilization, and then the use of human embryos for research, which Bill Saunders mentioned in the early 2000s in particular, and the whole embryonic stem cell research discussions, like the destroying of embryonic human life. So again, very clinical, sort of very biologically focused, very body focused. And this has been also our experience at the NCBC going back to the 1970s. Most of the work that we do day in and day out deals with these kinds of questions still today. So we field about 1,500 consultations from individuals all around the country and some from around the world, free of charge. And this includes things like medical doctors, nurses, parish priests, bishops, and also the laity in the pews, who call us and ask us questions like, is it okay to discontinue this ventilator or to stop assisted nutrition and hydration in this particular case scenario? And so I'm not getting questions through our free consultation service like, hey, how can I use AI? Right? Like, this is something that it's definitely happening, it's coming, but people aren't aware of it. And we're not even seeing it in our actual consultations yet, right? So it's entering the door sort of quietly, which is, of course, all the more reason why it's great that we are talking about this now, and we need to get our heads together on this. But the really interesting thing is now, when we talked about all those violations of human rights of the body, the destruction of embryos, the killing of fetuses, and so on and so forth, those were violations of essentially the human body person, where the emphasis is on the body. When we're thinking about AI, it's now as though we've shifted the kind of violation of human rights that may be occurring to, when we think about a body-soul unity, which is a person, right? We're now trying to imitate a soul when we think about intelligence, right? The idea is that we're imitating an intellect. An intellect is a faculty of the soul, the immaterial soul. And so it's now the violations of human rights that we have to think about are immaterial. They're not bodily violations. And so there's this new dimension, and it's a little bit fuzzier. It's a little bit harder to grasp, right? Because the soul is something that's immaterial. It's harder to grasp. And so what are those defining lines? How do we know when to say, oh, this is immoral, or we shouldn't be doing this? It's a hard question. But I do think there are some genuine risks of violating human rights that I'm going to get to in just a few moments. But to name just a few more connecting points of AI with healthcare right now that we're already encountering and seeing, in the world of diagnostics, AI is amazing. AI can do some incredible things when it comes to, for example, breast cancer diagnosis or other situations of this sort, where, again, you're able to process large amounts of data to see what the risk factors are. Statistical analysis, basically. That's what AI is really good at, probability, statistics. Because it's processing and crunching large volumes of data, it can give us a really good sense of how likely it is that this particular woman is going to develop breast cancer. And at even what age perhaps, and so on and so forth. And that can be incredibly helpful to a doctor-patient encounter in terms of prevention or in terms of being prepared for when it does happen, if there's not going to be a preventive intervention. There's also a DAX Copilot. I don't know if you've heard about this, but among the various AIs, right, you've got your Chat GPTs and you've got, your Gemini and so on. The list goes on and on. But DAX Copilot is a Microsoft product, basically, that's used in healthcare in the context of office visits. It's ambient listening software. And so this DAX Copilot is something that can be used for doctors having a patient interaction to just allow AI to listen in on that doctor-patient visit. And then it can summarize the visit because it's listening, it's processing everything that's said, it's transferring the verbal statements into writing, and then that's written up as a report. So the doctor doesn't have to spend the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes after the appointment writing up everything from that encounter, or we're still spending a whole bunch of time sitting at the computer staring at the screen while he's talking to the patient, right? So that's something that's actually, I would say, a positive development that's already happening in healthcare right now, which can allow for better doctor-patient interactions, because we want to find those things that are wholesome and helpful for doctors to relate more personally with their patients. Well, in all of this, the ultimate key and the major connecting point of the whole field of bioethics with artificial intelligence is this very question of the human person. Who or what is a human person? That's what we call anthropology, and that anthropology is what drives moral decision-making. You have to know and understand who and what a person is in order to understand how you treat a human person. And so this is the crux and connecting point between our field of bioethics, which is all based upon having a proper anthropology so we can understand and respect the body. So I already gave a whole number of examples, for example, of this declassifying of some human beings that's very typical of the bioethics that we know of the past 50 years, where we would take, for example, a human being, a human organism, and say, oh, that's just tissue, right? Like a fetus that's developing in the womb, that's just tissue. So we've declassified a human person, and indeed a human organism, by calling it just a bunch of cells. Or we could think about the disabled individual at the end of life, or someone who's in a coma, where we might say, hey, this individual is now no longer functional, or they're close enough to being dead. Maybe they've lost their personhood. Of course, those who are in the field of bioethics are very familiar with Peter Singer, who is famous for his approach to personhood, and again, considering certain persons who may not be conscious to be non-persons, right? If you're not conscious, you're not a person, ergo you don't have the rights that human persons should receive. A very functional emphasis. Free will and determinism. I'm going to take a minute and just reflect on this with you. It's particularly compelling for me because it ties into my own personal story of how I got into bioethics, right? I mentioned 2004, I was an undergrad at University of Pennsylvania. Biological Basis of Behavior was the technical title of my major. And so it was really all intertwined with how do we understand the reasons why and how can we predict behavior in ultimately human beings, but in any organism, right? Biological basis of behavior. So we're talking about determinants, what leads us to make certain choices or to carry out certain actions. So to me, this was one of the very questions that got me digging deeper into my Catholic faith at the time, because I just kept thinking, this is just so reductive. How can we, in every course I'm taking here, we're talking about all these influence from the genetics to the biology, and we're constantly talking about stimulus and response, inputs and outputs, neurons firing left and right, and it just really felt like at the end of the day, we're saying there's just nothing more to us. There's just nothing more to the human person. That's all it boils down to, and if we have sufficient data about all of those details from the genetics all the way up to your environment, then we can completely predict every behavior of this person. And the more I thought about this and the more I was digging into my faith, I remember at one point sitting there in my evolutionary neurobiology class as the professor is talking, and it just suddenly hit me. There is no love if there's no free will. like the whole concept that we can love people is completely irrelevant. That term is devoid of meaning. Love means nothing. It's simply a series of neuronal reactions, chemical reactions, all determined, and so on and so forth. And so this point is very important and interesting when it comes back to AI, because ultimately, at the end of the day, as much as we get into this whole discussion about what is AI, how should we use it, we have to be very clear that it is not, can never be human, and it cannot love, right? AI cannot love. So as much as it might be able to simulate affection, it might be able to simulate or even stimulate certain feelings in us, because we do have bodies and we do have emotions and we do have neurons that fire in response to certain inputs that we receive. And so all of that can be elicited when we get AI interacting with us in a certain way. So like a chatbot that takes on a persona and is able to impact our emotions and our passions, that can happen and it's real. But the sad reality is that in this situation, there literally is nothing behind it. It is literally empty. And so there is no true love. There's no true charity. There's no true warmth. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's cold, devoid, and empty. And so we have to keep this in mind. Anytime we're talking about this question of artificial intelligence, that we must avoid any conflation of whatever artificial intelligence can do with genuine charity and love. And of course, this extends to all of the virtues. It extends to faith, to hope, and so on and so forth. And of course, as I said before, there's no genuine decision-making in AI. It's just decision paths that are determined by algorithms and large volumes of data, even though they may appear to be creative, and in fact, they may do things we don't expect. It is still just input and output driven. So a few reflections on church teachings in artificial intelligence. Obviously, we can take everything I've just said to that next step and say, from a theological standpoint, obviously the human person is made in the image and the likeness of God. And so there is a spiritual life, an interiority, all of the passions. We have reason, virtue, we have wisdom. And wisdom is something different from processing large volumes of data. And that stems from experience, a lived experience, an ability to connect with another real person. And that person may be another human being, but it can also be an angelic being, could be angels, could be God, could be the saints in heaven, right? These are still persons with whom we can have interactions on that spiritual plane, and that can be part of a genuine lived experience, again, with which AI can never interact. We also must keep in mind the question of the sacraments, the call to a life in Christ, and remember that life in Christ is relationship. And so we interact at a level of personal encounter with Christ himself, with the three persons of the Trinity itself being a communion of persons, and grace flows from this to us into our life. And so there's just something that, again, especially when you start getting to these more ethereal conversations around what AI could do, we have to be clear that it can't do the sorts of things that a human being with a soul can do. So the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Dicastery for Culture and Education published a note called Antiqua et Nova earlier this year, January 28th, 2025. So I just want to point this out as an actual document from the church, which speaks to a number of these issues. And what I really loved about this document is that it pulls significantly on this notion of a distinction between the wisdom of the heart, right? These concepts that are tied to the soul, and how there's this very personal dimension to this, and the distinction with something like an algorithm. It makes very clear that what AI does is actually an imitation or a mirroring, and it is not genuinely intelligence at all. Basically, so the term artificial intelligence is something that we really shouldn't even be using, but unfortunately we have to accept because nobody would know what we're talking about if we don't. And so we just don't want to let it deceive us, which again is one of the biggest threats of AI, is that it can deceive us into believing that it is human, that it is a being, and so forth. artificial procreation. I want to reflect a little bit on this. This is not something directly related here. So I'm very grateful for the reflections in Antiqua et Nova. But as I was reflecting on AI, and again, just the topics I deal with every day in my bioethics work, which include a lot of in vitro fertilization questions, restorative reproductive medicine. We're getting these questions all day left and right. And we have a very well-developed tradition from Donum Vitae in 1987 to Dignitas Personae in 2008, documents of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that deal with the question of assisted reproduction or artificial procreation. And so it got me thinking at a certain point, how does it approach this question? Right? The way I've typically thought of the question of in vitro fertilization has been in terms of this dynamic of the child has a right to be conceived, gestated, born within and raised within marriage. This is a quote from Donum Vitae that I frequently go back to. And so the starting point for the church's reflection on IVF is the child, is the dignity of that child. And then the church extrapolates and says, now because this child has such great dignity, this child can only be conceived in a certain way, because to be conceived in any different way would be a violation of that child's rights. And so there's something there, there's something deeper there to me that I hadn't quite thought about before. And so to tie it in with the AI, what I see there now is that this fact of the child's right to be conceived within marriage, my mind was first falling on the conceived, right, which is the physical act of conception. But actually, the rest of the sentence goes on to say, born within, raised within marriage. That's a relational question. So that's not a physical body question. That's a relational question. So the child has that right to be raised in a context with certain people in relationship. And so when you think about AI and where AI can go, again, it can remove the whole notion of genuine human relationship. And if you remove that notion of human relationship, again, you have a violation of a right of a human being. I want to extrapolate this a little bit, right? This is where I'm going, right? I'm starting with IVF, but I think we can extrapolate that to a broader societal level. So each individual child has a right to be conceived, raised within marriage, which is a relationship context between a mother, father, and child. But then we know the family is the basic unit of a society. And so there's a right, in fact, within a society to be in relationship with other real human beings. So we can't replace those other human beings with AI, long story short. And here's where, so the language in Dignitas Personae and Donum Vitae that we frequently use to know, hey, well, which reproductive technologies are legitimate to use and which ones are not? The language that we typically use is, hey, if it's a technology that assists conception, it assists the couple's marital act between husband and wife, which is a relational act, an embodied relational act between husband and wife that leads to the child. If we're assisting that action, then that's a legitimate use of reproductive technology. But if we're replacing that one flesh union between husband and wife, which is that personal relational act, now it's immoral. Now it's an intrinsic moral evil. And again, similarly, maybe something like this is a framework for thinking about AI, right? To the extent that AI can assist building community and human relationship and getting us, better results on those medical tests, or enabling that doctor to talk with the patient without the distraction of the screen. Great. That is assisting human relationship and community here and the good of health for these patients. But if we're going to use AI to have the sick patient go up to the screen and, type in their symptoms, and then AI is going to spit back and say, you have cancer and you're going to die in 5 days. This is not good, right? This is a removal of human relation. It may be right. It could be completely accurate, right? But you've removed human relationship. And so this would be, I would say, a violation even of a right of a human person to have that properly built relationship and community that enables the strengthening of that community and the overall good of the individual patient and of the interactions that follow. So I actually put up the actual quote here from Donum Vitae. It's in part 2, that about the child having this right, which is through the secure and recognized relationship to his own parents. There's that language about the right to a relationship. And then it goes on further and speaks about the social responsibilities of the person that are tied to this, again, relationship. So there's a vitality and stability of society that require that children come into the world within a family. And again, I would take it a step further and say, and that individuals and families interact in a larger community with other persons and are not isolated from that, trapped in a world of AI. This actually got me thinking, there's a famous experiment that was totally unethical that happened with young children and how they learn language and how they respond to interactions. I can't remember it right now. This just kind of popped into my head. But basically what had happened was they conducted experiments to see how the child would react if there was no interaction with a mother or a father, just sort of isolated in a room. And of course, it's terrible, right? A horribly unethical kind of experiment to do, and it's a psychological experiment. Okay, this is like sort of the perfect example in my mind of the kind of direction or the place we could land with AI if we start having, the replacement of human relationship with chatbots. You've got a mental health a condition, or you're struggling with depression, or you've got anxiety, and you've got a chatbot that's going to talk to you and try to make you feel better. Well, maybe you will feel better temporarily, but in the end, it's going to be devoid and empty, and you're actually not building genuine relationship, and it's going to be harmful and a violation, I would say, again, of human rights there. But to put the positive spin on that, just to be clear, right, you could have a situation where you use a chat GPT or some other kind of chatbot that's specifically designed to give initial inputs, maybe, to a person who might not want to go to a real human being first, right? Who may be in an isolated world and is struggling with human relationship, and maybe that's the very cause of what they're struggling with in their mental health situation. But they would be willing to explore and ask a question to an online AI. Now, in that situation, if the AI is programmed properly, because it all comes back to how you program it, right? It has to have a goal, it has to have a framework to operate it within. And if the goal or the framework is to get a person who connects with AI to real people, then that could be a good thing, right? Like, again, it could serve as a conduit that assists with connecting an isolated, lost soul to a real person and a real sense of community as the ultimate outcome. And there's where it could be a legitimate application. So in conclusion, what is it that we need to navigate this AI revolution? How do we defend and promote human rights in this AI revolution? Well, number one, we need charity, which is love, heart and soul. They must be a part of any effort that we want to undertake to properly utilize AI or to navigate the waves of this revolution. So we need to lean into true personal encounter as much as possible, maybe even more than ever. I know COVID was a big hit against in-person contact with people, and we need to regain it. We need to regain that as a society, as a culture, and it will enable us to better confront the challenges of AI as well. We need to lean into our spiritual lives. That true intelligence, the intellect and the will, right, that are the faculties of the soul, we need to lean into those, use those, develop that spiritual life, cultivate the life of grace, pray, connect with our Lord, with the saints, tap in to all of those things. And actually, as a sequelae to that, I would say we need to lean into sacrifice and suffering. Because one of the challenges with human relationships is that we're all limited. And we're sinful, and we sometimes hurt each other. And so sometimes it's hurtful to try to engage in personal encounter with real people, right? And that's tough. But sometimes we need to lean into that suffering, to accept that suffering as our Lord did on the cross, to bear with others, to bear patiently even wrongs against us, perhaps, in the context of those personal encounters, so that we can develop deeper relationships. And as we know from the spiritual life, we know from the Gospels, when we lean into sacrifice, when we lean into that suffering and we accept it, it's transformed. Christ was raised from the dead. It's transformed into life, to healing, to love. And that could even happen, for example, if we have to make some tough choices around, hey, if we use AI in this way, maybe it's actually going to increase our overall physical lifespans. But is it going to enable us to flourish in human community? And if we have to take that choice, right? We live longer or we damage our human relationships and are unable to truly flourish, I'd say we need to emphasize that flourishing, right? Maybe we need to lean into that further, which ties into one other big point that just comes to mind now, right? When we think about public health, and the whole public health sphere is actually an area that could be, again, very appropriate for helpful AI interventions when we're looking at population level data to try to find good solutions at the population level. But it also comes with a huge risk of, well, now we're going to, based on this population level data, require or force all people down a particular path in order to achieve the goal of greater health for the whole. Let's say 90% of people would survive if we took this path, whereas maybe only 60% would survive if we take this other path. But path B here, the second path, with 60% overall survival, might be the path that involves a strong and flourishing human life, and all those, or many of those who may die in that other missing 20%, that could be a situation where they've died peacefully, they've died with love, they've died with their families, right? They've died going to heaven because they were prepared for the sacraments, right? Now, I am not, please don't misunderstand me, by any stretch of the imagination suggesting that we should not try to prolong life and save people, right? Healing is the priority and the ministry of medicine. And so we definitely want to continue to try to save lives, prolong lives, where that is proportionate and reasonable. But we just have to remember the scale of values. That's all, right? Like, we need to remember there is a scale of values, and we can't render absolute the physical good that maybe AI can tell us would be the best outcome over the strength of our human relationships and communities. That's all. And so the final thing is we need to engage this genie that's already out of the bottle, because AI is already out there. It's already very active. And so I'll just end on this last slide with a few suggestions for how we engage this AI genie that's gotten out of the bottle. I mean, number one, just very practically, we can start to avoid or block AI chat access to vulnerable groups. Of course, we think about young children first and foremost, right? We don't want them getting into AI chats with chatbots that might be leading them down destructive paths or giving them a false sense of human companionship that's really fake and which is ultimately going to be destructive. There's a number of tragic cases already happening where people get into these situations and then maybe even their parents don't even know about it. They're talking to these chatbots. They're developing what they think are relationships that are giving them positive feedback on an affectionate level or otherwise by the nice words that they may read. But then they can lead them down paths of destruction, ultimately to isolation or to suicide. Second, we need more intentional Christians in the AI sector. So we don't want to run away from this, right? We don't want to just say, oh my goodness, AI, let's all run away. We need Christians in there. We need to better understand what's happening and be part of the solution. And so getting Christians who are intentional about that faith, who have that proper anthropological grounding, who understand that body-soul unity, who understand how AI is different and fake compared to true intelligence and the soul, they need to be in there so that they can shape helpful uses and applications of AI. Third, we need to evangelize the current leaders in the AI and tech sector because, hey, people in positions of power have a huge influence. You know, and Elon Musk or others of this ilk, right? Sam Altman. We want to pray for them. We want to find ways, if we have ways, to evangelize, to help them to understand that dignity of the person, that anthropological foundation, and why this is so dangerous, and encourage them ultimately to help do this well. Fourth, we need to form Christian leaders in the culture, in Catholic healthcare, in education, or even just parents, Catholic parents, and other Christians, for sound uses and regulation of AI. Again, maybe around this model of trying to find ways that AI can truly assist, but without substituting or replacing for a genuine human relation. And then finally, in the last place, I would say public policy restrictions and incentives. And the reason I put it last is simply because this is a whole different ballgame. And it's a very difficult ballgame when you're talking about public policy restrictions or incentives. And by restrictions, I mean obviously restrictions on bad uses of AI and incentives for good uses of AI. But that's a whole prudential sphere that requires a different level of engagement. But all of these things, in any case, one way or another, and this is what I'll wrap it up with here, all of these things in one form or another can't be accomplished just by any one individual of us. And again, so I'm coming back to that theme, right? We need to work on this together. And so again, I applaud and I thank the Catholic University of America for having me here and for encouraging these very sorts of conversations so that we can meet one another, we can talk with one another, we can collaborate with one another, and we can work together building that community that is needed to also find the right solutions for moving forward with integrity and securing human rights and dignity. So thank you all.
So I know we have microphones. Yeah, we've got microphones. So any questions? You can do it. Yeah, you can go. How many questions?
You want me to pick somebody? Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? Thank you, John. That was great. So as you've said, Mother Church has a really rich tradition for dealing with problems like this: consciousness, relationship of body and soul, criteria for technical domination with JP2 and others. My question is, using the metaphor of a doctor trying to convince a pregnant woman to get an abortion by saying, "Don't worry, your baby doesn't have a soul," how much of this problem that we're dealing with can simply be attributed to bearing false witness on the part of companies selling these products?
You're right. Great question. Hard to quantify, but I would say a huge question is precisely this: are we properly identifying when something is AI or not? Is a key piece. In other words, I think that if you're going to have a proper use of AI, one of the factors should be the person using it needs to know that it's actually AI and not a real person. I don't know if that's getting at what you're saying there, but I do think if you're marketing it as anthropomorphic, as, hey, this is intended to be companion robot or companion AI, you know, sorry? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Right. Yes, and the selling of it as humanoid is a problem. Yes, I would say that. Yes. Yes. Maureen.
Fantastic talk. I was particularly struck by your analogy that comparable to insults against the body, you can actually have insults against the soul, against the dignity of the soul, by depriving people of their both obligation and their right to make decisions through their informed conscience. So in the context of healthcare, if it becomes normative for AI to make decisions for healthcare workers, are you envisioning, or would you care to comment on the need for conscience protections?
Yes.
For
absolutely.
people to object to and to simply refuse to obey the standard of practice that comes about through a mechanism that does not involve human decision making?
Absolutely, yes. I would definitely advocate for the protections for conscience for that very sort of situation, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. You mentioned the principle that undergirds artificial contraception. I thought that was a really great analogy or framework to how we think about AI, about assisting and replacing. So AI, however, it imitates human intelligence, so it's immaterial. And I wonder, at what point can we say that it's not merely assisting but replacing? Because already, even just in the business world, AI is just sweeping up jobs that, oh, this can be done by AI, or, I don't need an accountant. And these are all very helpful things, but there will also be a lot of people out of jobs. So I guess, what are some principles for assessing when AI becomes, when it replaces human work and the human dignity as a result, versus when it just assists?
That is a great question, and it definitely needs some more fleshing out in my own thinking as well, to be honest, right? This is just initial reflections here, but the replacing, what I can say for sure is this: the replacing that I have in mind is not necessarily replacing a job, actually, but replacing quality human interactions. And that may or may not be the same thing, because you could have situations where there may be loss of jobs, but maybe there are other opportunities for other work that replace them, right? In other words, you're not necessarily replacing the person or the job per se in a situation like this, but you may be having other opportunities that arise for the individual to find work. Now, I think you would need a few distinctions in here, but I do think that if the amount of work replacement were of such a degree that really you're actually destroying human relationship in a local community, and again, I can't put like a number value to that, right? But yeah, if you were to sort of totally decimate a particular community that's going to lose 80% of its workforce in that local area, that could have drastic damaging effects on all of the families and the relationships in that community. And that might be an instance of, you could say, replacing of the human relationship component. Okay, but if you're talking about something like, well, actually, it may be just a small portion of the workforce in this particular area that's affected, and maybe they're going to be able to find new work, or maybe AI is going to help find new work as part of that, right? So it's not just a job elimination, but maybe there's also a job creation, so that stability and relationships are able to be maintained in that community. I'm just kind of frustrating this out, talking through as in response to your great question. But yeah, it is an analogy, and we need to work on more of the particulars of what exactly that means for something like job losses. Yeah. Yes, Father.
So, based on and the first part that you said, that AI is very good producing outputs based on the inputs that it's out there. So you're aware in the AI that is used in healthcare, if those inputs are according to a correct anthropological point of view of the human being, based on Catholic point of view, but at the same time, which is based in natural law and is for everyone, not only for Catholics.
Yes.
That helps to produce that very good inputs, actually correcting misconducts, And if there's some boundaries also put in those inputs, I don't know if you're aware if those AI systems used in healthcare use these correct foundations, anthropological speaking. You know what I mean?
Yes, I'm not aware, to be totally honest, of what framework any of these AI systems are using. One thing I can say is that I do believe, I was actually watching the panel discussion that was put on by the Institute for Human Ecology just a few weeks ago, with Father Michael Baggett on there as well, and he actually mentioned about Magisterium AI, which is a program that he's on the advisory board for. Is that right, Father? Okay. And so for example, they are working on ensuring that the model or the framework is a Catholic anthropological framework, and that it's securing, the kinds of inputs and outputs from the magisterium. So there's oversight, is my point, in that example. I would doubt that any of the currently implemented practices went through any kind of vetting from a Christian anthropological standpoint, which is not to say that they may not happen to be okay. Okay, but I'm virtually certain that none of them have been put together with this explicit goal in mind of ensuring a sound Christian anthropological framework, your understanding of the human person, which isn't just strictly Christian, sorry, by the way. Yeah, as you said, it's natural moral law. So Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Thank you for a great presentation. It was awesome. So when this ChatGPT came out, I said, I'm going to go test this thing and say, what would Preston Knowles say about fogo de chão? Let's say Brazilian steakhouse. And I did it twice, and I got two very different answers. They were both plausible, but totally wrong. I would say everybody should go at least once in their lifetime to know what it's like. But it was making me to be an ogre or to be someone who was completely loose. And if you try and make a reservation, and I did, because fogo de chão has AI taking your reservation. It's not a human being. Is there a special occasion? Celebrate my birthday. They didn't get that right. I didn't get my free dessert. So that I talked to the manager about this. So this is really not a very satisfactory experience. No human being would have made that mistake. He said, we've had a lot of negative feedback about that, but it's coming down from above. And so as people have problems with this, I don't think it's wise to trust this machine type responses on anything that's of great importance.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's trusting it without any review, human review, is something that I would not advise. I think that, there may be a place or a point where if you're sufficiently sure that you trust how the algorithm was put together. So for example, again, taking the Magisterium AI as just an example, right, as a reference point, if you trust the people who put it together and the both in terms of the, let's call it the anthropological framework and the trustworthiness of the data inputs, and so forth, then, and also the on the AI level, and again, this would be an area I wouldn't know how to judge myself, right? But like if you're like, oh, like this is actually high quality AI versus like poor quality AI, I can't distinguish that, but maybe some experts in the field can, right? And they would say, oh no, actually this one I know is put together according to this standard, and it's going to be a much more reliable AI. And we have this oversight that we're assuring you has been put in place. I would say it is possible that you could trust some of these sources. The question is about what is still very important, right? Like, I don't know that I would trust it with extremely sensitive matters, but certainly for basic things like, hey, did it get my reservation right? You could, yeah. But I do think also these are going to get way better over. I mean, for everything that I've been looking at in the short time I've been reviewing this stuff, it seems to me that they're going to get way better at being accurate in a relatively short time, just in the next few years, I imagine. So I don't know how long your problem with the Fogo de Chão steakhouse will continue. Joe, yeah.
John, thank you. Beautiful talk. And I just wanted to amplify what Maureen said about that insight that you shared with us about bioethics, worrying about insults and injuries to the body part, and the things that we're talking about, AI ethics, really being opportunities of insult or injury to the soul, to the integrity of the soul. And so it was really awesome. I wanted to reflect back on Antiquet Nova that you mentioned, and what was striking to me there, and you brought it out when you talked about the fact of love, that AI is never going to love you, is that they talked a lot about the three pillars: truth, beauty, and goodness, that we pursue as humans. And it really did not even have the word beauty in the document. It was quite striking absence of thinking about the importance of beauty in human anthropology, that we generate beauty, and AI is going to become very good at generating lots of things, visual, poetry, or whatever. But the ability to recognize and appreciate beauty is going to be something that AI will never be able to do. But it will be generating a lot of things, that will challenge us to say, is that beautiful, that AI generated thing beautiful or not? And of some concern, it will be generating so many things that younger people who don't have the honed skills of aesthetics to recognize beauty will be very challenged to develop their own innate human ability to recognize and appreciate beauty. And of course, beauty is one of the things that brings us to God. Right. And so I think that's a real threat. The beauty sector of AI is a thing that we really need to worry about a lot.
Yes. Thank you, Joe.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. You gave us a lot of food for thought tonight. I have a question. This is maybe not a super well thought out question, so forgive me for that. But even in our language tonight, we've been talking about AI replacing human beings, but that language itself suggests a sort of agency that like this thing AI could replace, and I feel like that is potentially an imprecise way to speak about it because it's not AI that would replace, it's human beings like attributing, like seeing AI as being able to replace us. And so I feel like one side of the question certainly is, AI's powers, ability. And then the other side is like how we understand AI to be. Because I think there needs to be like an understanding, especially in young people that are flying to this helpful tool too much, that we can't give it power to replace. It's not that it's going to replace, it's we will like cede power over to it. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that is an excellent point, and I agree. There's no question. At the end of the day, the active agent isn't AI. It's always the person who's making a decision about what to do in response to what AI does, right? So the AI will produce an output, and then it's a person has to decide what am I going to do with that output from AI. And so again, chatbot situation or something like that, then it's like, okay, well, this chatbot responded with this sentence. Now, what do I do with that sentence? What does it mean to me? How do I act? What moral decision do I then make? Because I'm the only one who can actually engage in, strictly speaking, even the philosophical terminology, a human act, which is where you have, object and circumstances. You can do an ethical analysis that only applies when there's genuine agency. So you have to have an intellect and a will, and AI does not have it. So it's a great point. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Joyce, how I know why Father Wagner.
Sir?
I didn't think I needed it. Thank you. John, excellent talk. Father Baggett, really, what a delight. Really appreciate it. Just a couple of comments. Thanks for your call out on Antica Nova. For those who have not read it, whether you're Catholic or not, I'm not yet. I would suggest please read it. It is the best document on the nature of human intelligence and non-human intelligence. Strongly recommended. The other comment, you mentioned magisterium twice, so I had to mention it a third time. But before I get there, one question I would ask is, what efforts are folks like you and others doing to bring non-Catholics who share the same values into the fold? You talked about a list of people to engage. What about individuals like me, organizations like those I represent, where we think we share the same values of individual, family, and community? Prosperity where you play, prosperity where you pray, and prosperity where you pay. How do we work more together to bring that shared thing up so that it's not individual groups fighting the battle against big Silicon Valley, but it's us working together?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that I would love to see more of that, and I'm very happy to encourage that, certainly from our end. I mean, I think the Catholic moral tradition also gives us the riches to engage with everyone out there of goodwill through the natural moral law and the understanding that when you talk about goods like family, community, and so forth, these are goods for human flourishing. They're not uniquely Catholic. And so this is something that we certainly can, I think, work together and should. In fact, that's part of exactly the vision I'm trying to spell out here. The more collaboration, the more personal encounter of all people of goodwill trying to engage with these issues, the better. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thanks so much. I thought your conclusion was super reasonable. Assuming that AI is a neutral technology. So my short question is, could you argue, if you had to argue the contra and say here are the reasons why AI should be resisted, what kinds of things, or what would be indicators of a point where, okay, now we understand that AI is not actually neutral and ought to be resisted? Are there any things that come to mind? I could elaborate a little bit more if you wanted a second to think, but I read a great article, I can't remember the guy's name, and it was called Why I'm an AI Hater. And he basically pushed on your assisting versus replacing distinction. And his point was anything we hand over to AI, we no longer actually do. So all your examples about researchers and they're going to get all this output from AI, but they haven't read any of the articles, they haven't engaged themselves. So is there a point, if you, I know it's not the point of your talk to argue the other, but if you wanted to, could you point us to any concerns where we might need to resist AI?
Well, sure. I mean, if I wanted to argue along those lines, I mean, you could simply you could point to the long-term outcomes of the failure to properly regulate AI. In other words, the failure to actually implement these kinds of approaches of limiting to certain forms of AI and having proper oversight. If you were to say, well, that's going to fail and the outcome is going to be so terrible that we shouldn't even start down that path, and it's better to just immediately say no completely to all AI with no exceptions, that's a case you could probably make. Now, what I would say is, and I just want to be clear about this, is sometimes, I mean, actually say frequently, in these conversations around ethics, the question of whether something is intrinsically immoral or actually neutral, but then there are prudential considerations, is often blurred. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I would still say that AI is neutral, even if I were to argue the opposite position. I shouldn't say the opposite position, but a different position. If I were to argue, hey, actually, we should completely resist AI because we're not going to be able to properly regulate it, and it's going to lead to this horrible outcome, so we better all get on board and stop it before it goes anywhere, I would argue it's still morally neutral. But what you're saying is that it's imprudent for us to allow even an effort to properly regulate it, which I believe is doomed to failure. And so that's how I would approach that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the talk. First, just a brief observation. I work in national security and technology, and in the context of artificial intelligence, at least, it's frequently discussed that the United States is in a competition with China. China is inherently a materialist society. It is a Marxist-Leninist government, and we see this up and down China on issues of bioethics. So it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind on the prudential conversation about public policy restrictions on the advancement of AI in that potentially adversarial environment where these capabilities are being developed anyway. Just an observation. A question for you. So this relates to national security. Brain-computer interface technology is increasingly prominent or promising. However, it does seem that some of the intention behind this technology is not only to restore human function, but perhaps even augment human function beyond what is typical. And one contemplated way to do this would be brain-computer interface technology that integrates human intelligence, so to say, with artificial intelligence. So is there a line beyond which that becomes intrinsically disordered in the Catholic bioethical tradition?
Great question. The short answer is I don't believe so. I would say that the question of the intrinsic disorder of that is something that's very difficult to say. I think it would be a question of more the prudential side. In other words, when you're talking about a distinction between enhancement and restoration of function, for example, that already on many levels is a prudential distinction. because you can't really, it's very difficult to identify exactly what the line is and by what standard we're measuring whether this particular intervention is an enhancement versus something that is a restoration of function. And so those are actually ongoing debates for some time, just in the field of, even other areas that involve genetics and so forth. You could get into these discussions. So the short answer is no, I don't think you would be able to say at a certain point that it was intrinsically disordered, but just that it probably at a certain point we would need to figure out would become just too far prudentially, because it might compromise the person's ability to actually think and act as a human. And that's a very blurry line, right? This whole space of transhumanism, there are many blurry lines of this sort, where I don't think we can say there's an intrinsic disorder point, like where it's clearly identified. Yep, you step that line, now it's intrinsically immoral.
What if we take our word and that is
Yeah.
Some of these AI capabilities are inherently not human. They're sort of alien. They're beyond what humans are capable of. So could that be a starting point maybe for the prudential conversation? Like,
Sure.
if Stephen Hawking is not capable of doing this, but you are because of technological augmentation, or everyone is able to do that, or are we going beyond the frontier of a human intelligence that would otherwise be characterized by relationality and embodiment and all the principles you're discussing? Would that be like a primary red flag?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that would be a very good starting point for a conversation of that sort. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. John, for your wonderful presentation. I want to, you rightly pointed out some benefits that AI presents, especially in the doctor-patient interface and the interaction. My question is around access to healthcare. How do we ensure equitable access to the benefits of AI in medicine for all, especially with the marginalized and vulnerable communities? What role should bioethics play in preventing a digital divide in the healthcare system? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I think it touches on a deeper, broader issue of just equitable access to all sorts of medical interventions at any level. In other words, a high-level intensive care and so on and so forth. I mean, I think that's a much broader conversation, and AI would just be one piece, because it would be one piece of technological opportunities or technological means which aren't necessarily distributed equitably around the world and in every location. I think bioethics does have something to say in this area and certainly can engage with this topic. But I think that's a much broader conversation around how you effectively accomplish something like this and what constitutes an appropriately equitable arrangement, because that is just that's a huge topic area in its own right, which I would say I don't have a short answer for right now. But yes, I think that it's within the realm of bioethics and healthcare ethics, absolutely. And we do want to be reflecting on and also engaging with that sort of question about how can we provide the best care or enable care opportunities for vulnerable populations or for impoverished populations. And so those are much needed conversations as well. And AI would be one piece of that. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Di Camillo. This was, I know everyone's been saying it's a great talk, but I figured I'd say it too. But I was curious because it seemed to me that a big theme that sort of ties a lot of this together is like the question of formation. And I remember when you mentioned like the threat to like individual like healthcare providers, doctors, bioethicists in making judgments of prudence and actually being able to make these sort of moral decisions, instead of everything sort of coming down from the top, whatever program the abstract, the higher ups have kind of decided. And a lot of your solutions seem to speak a lot to particularly addressing formation instead of, which makes sense because it's obviously very complicated. And so I guess, if you could speak more to, other like solutions beyond, or speak to that, what you see to be the importance of formation, and if you have anything else besides what you suggested to that end.
Okay. And by formation, you're talking about formation of the individual, like formation of conscience, formation of, let's say, the interior life. Is that what you're referencing? Okay. Yes. No, I think that is definitely a critical piece. I guess what I would add is that the formation, it is an important piece of this, and also part of the theme, that formation is not just a formation in isolation, that it's a formation also in community, which involves engagement with others. So in order to, I think, form one's conscience well, there needs to be engagement not just with content and with data and reading, which is good and is a critical piece of that, but also with other people, talking with others who might be in the same field or who might have additional expertise. And this actually does tie into that overall arching point about when we're bringing together groups and communities, we're able to bring different perspectives and on a similar issue, and maybe bring different expertise into the picture that helps me see and understand an aspect of the issue in a way I didn't before. Or maybe I had an understanding of certain quotes from sacred scripture or from the catechism or from whatever sources that I thought was the proper interpretation, but now I'm engaged with someone else of goodwill who is giving me a different viewpoint, and I'm saying, oh, I never thought about it that way. Actually, maybe I've learned something new and I need to approach this differently. But to the point about the medical standards, maybe in particular, that was one of the examples. Medical standards, I do think it's very important that the way we develop medical standards, because we're already in a situation where medical standards are highly impacted by ideologies. For example, you can give a laundry list of all the different organizations that have medical standards that are contrary to basic human dignity, on the mental health level with the transgender question and on abortion and so on and so forth. And so, it's all the more important that we have conversations and formation that's going to go into the development of good standards, which goes beyond just an ideological group that's a closed group, and that also goes beyond, of course, handing it over to AI, where nobody is really, in a sense, saying what this should be apart from the people who built the formula or the algorithm. So.